Hello, I'm Dr. Deborah Owens, and it's time for some tea. Thank you for sharing some tea with me as I spill some tea, as in truth, about education. I'm a literacy professor and education policy researcher with decades of experience in education. Today, I've been thinking about reading instruction in the United States. It seems that these days there's something new, a new methodology being touted as the cure for low reading scores. If you Google the new science of reading, you'll get a lot of hits directing you to programs, consulting firms, and websites dedicated to guiding teachers and school districts through the very weighty research about how to teach reading, like it's something new. But is it really new? As I think about the history of reading instruction in the United States, I can't help but to envision a merry-go-round. If you've ever taken a child to a merry-go-round and stood on the sidelines, you'll relate to this metaphor. Every time the child cycles by you, you give a celebratory wave. I think you'll see what I mean as I take you through a very brief history of reading instruction in the United States and understand why I think a merry-go-round is an apt metaphor for thinking about reading instruction in the U.S. Even before we were a country during the colonial period, we had a system for teaching children to read. Of course, as a Puritan society, religious training was at the core of reading instruction, as you can see. The example of this New England primer demonstrates this clearly with a cautionary note to children: the idle fool is whipped at school. You'll also note the syllabary method of teaching reading with easy syllables for children. The emphasis was on the phonetic properties of the letters and would be read in a list form. I would suggest that this method for teaching reading is a precursor to developing what we now think of as reading fluency and phonics instruction. I think children at that time, however, might agree that this is a fairly lifeless way to learn to read, and I can certainly understand why some children, who even those are able to attend school, might actually prefer the activities of the idle fool. By the 1830s, it was clear that a system for providing a common education for students was needed in our growing nation. Horace Mann is often referred to as the father of the common school movement, also recognized that a different method for teaching reading was needed. The McGuffey readers represent a shift from the syllabary method, and importantly, these readers introduced illustrations that would be more interesting and appealing to young children. Instead of reading lists of syllables, the McGuffey readers offered real words or whole words and short stories. I see a parallel between the words introduced in the McGuffey readers and what we commonly call sight words today. The idea was to engage children in authentic reading experiences, which were undoubtedly more motivating than the earlier primers. A century later, from 1930 to 1965, the Fun with Dick and Jane series followed a similar methodology with whole words, repetitive passages, and a slow progression into reading stories about an ideal family with father, mother, Dick, Jane, Sally, Spot the dog, and Puff the cat. I learned to read with the Dick and Jane books. Of course, I had no idea that a storm was brewing about how I was learning to read. In 1955, Rudolf Flesch published what has become an iconic critique of reading instruction at that time. And as you'll see, for decades to follow, Johnny couldn't read, according to Flesch, because he hadn't been taught phonics. And so it appears that the merry-go-round had revolved 360 degrees back to the syllabary method from the early primers, the precursor to phonics instruction. Although Flesch's book was published in the 1950s, you will see that its influence has continued for decades and is still being published today. This was the era from the 1950s through the 1970s in which sides were drawn and labels were ascribed. The look-say method, now strongly associated with the Dick and Jane series, was excoriated as inefficient and ineffective in teaching reading. The phonics method was positioned as superior. Dick and Jane books were put on a shelf or even in a closet. They became associated with the whole language method. It was proposed that teaching decoding of phonetic features should always come before reading of whole words. Teachers were often at odds with each other and/or school administration. Underlying the reading wars, however, was a much larger issue. Ineffective reading instruction was at the heart of the perceived message that schools in the United States were failing and teachers were not doing the essential job of effectively teaching children to read, thus committing them to a future of educational failure. It was ugly. Indeed, there was a great deal that needed to be done to improve our schools. However, I would say that it had less to do with teachers and teaching methods and more to do with creating equity for students in schools. The National Academy of Education was formed in 1965 as part of ESEA policies and civil rights legislation to ensure greater funding for schools and greater opportunities for low-income students, which included large numbers of minority students. The National Academy of Education would be instrumental in driving education reforms in coming years. In 1983, the federal government issued a report that would dramatically change the trajectory of the conversation about everything to do with education in the United States. If we thought the reading wars were bad enough, now the federal government was overtly using warlike rhetoric to disparage education in the U.S. writ large. It begins with the following pronouncement: "Our nation is at risk. If an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to impose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we have allowed this to happen to ourselves. We have even squandered the gains in student achievement made in the wake of the Sputnik challenge. Moreover, we have dismantled essential support systems which helped make those gains possible. We have, in effect, been committing an act of unthinking, unilateral educational disarmament." Within 2 years of the publication of A Nation at Risk in 1985, the National Academy of Education published its report, Becoming a Nation of Readers. Noteworthy literacy researchers concluded with several recommendations. Among these were the need for more phonics instruction and increased testing of children. At the same time, however, proponents of whole language methodology pushed back. Reading war skirmishes continued, but the reality was that children continued to learn to read in classrooms that taught whole language methods and in classrooms that taught phonics as the basis for learning to read. In 1982, President Reagan appointed Robert Sweet as director of the National Academy of Education. It was under his directorship that Becoming a Nation of Readers was published. In 1989, Sweet was commissioned by Senator William Armstrong and the Senate Republican Committee to write a report entitled "Illiteracy, an Incurable Disease or Educational Malpractice." He later went on to found the National Right to Read Foundation. As the merry-go-round revolves another 360 degrees, this report, which again excoriated any reading methodology that didn't feature phonics, included direct quotes from Robert Flesh's 1955 book, Why Johnny Can't Read. Although early attempts to federally mandate phonics instruction failed, Robert Sweet dedicated the rest of his life to his campaign to winning the reading wars. He is credited with providing the language for No Child Left Behind with respect to implementing scientifically based reading research, SBRR mandates. By the 1980s and 90s, several widely known reading experts proposed a truce of sorts in the reading wars. Giants in the field, Fountas and Pinnell and Lucy Calkins, among others, promoted a balanced literacy approach, which combined best practices from both warring factions. It can be said that the balanced literacy approach is student-centered and comprehensive. However, the right balance requires expertise and training. It wasn't a scripted program, and therefore teachers often interpreted it in different ways. And for the most part, those in the phonics camp weren't satisfied with the amount of attention paid to decoding strategies or phonics instruction. It interrupted their narrative that phonics should always be the foundation of learning to read. In April 2000, the National Reading Panel published its findings. This became the definitive report of what constitutes effective reading instruction in the United States. These findings would soon form the basis for finally being able to mandate phonics instruction across the nation. Under President George W. Bush, No Child Left Behind became the law of the land, with the National Reading Panel's report forming the curricular foundation of the legislation. Schools receiving the plentiful funds provided through No Child Left Behind and Reading First grants were required to implement phonics-based programs and increase standardized assessments. Not only would No Child Left Behind and Reading First usher in a supercharged era of educational reform, but it would also prove to have far-reaching implications for the education industry as a whole. While the profit incentive for education reform is nothing new, massive amounts of cash began flowing to industries that included commercial reading programs, assessments, technology, and nonprofit organizations ready to provide consultants to schools aligning their reading instruction curriculums with Reading First. This flow of cash would ensure that education reform would be a major part of the education market for years to come. No Child Left Behind provided millions upon millions of dollars in grants to institutions like the University of Oregon and Florida State University to develop assessment tools and teaching materials. However, in 2007, congressional hearings were held to investigate the developers of the DIBELS reading assessments from the University of Oregon and ascertained that since some of the same reading experts also served on committees that approved state applications for No Child Left Behind Reading First grant funds and were contracted by major textbooks and reading program companies, there was a significant conflict of interest. In other words, they had a practice of only approving state applications that adopted a very short list of assessments and reading programs that were associated with them and that they profited from. Some people made a lot of money from No Child Left Behind legislation. However, if it yielded a nation of readers, so be it. If students were able to read on grade level by the third grade, it would be worth it, right? Well, more on that in a minute. For those looking to cash in on education reform, there have been a number of sources for funds. An article in the New York Times reported that since 1996, for-profit companies had captured about 300 billion of the $340 billion spent on education in the United States. That year, the Lehman Brothers investment firm sponsored the first education industry investment conference in New York. While Lehman Brothers collapsed during the debacle of the mortgage bubble in 2008 due to high risk investments, the education industry continued to be profitable for venture capitalists. In no small part, education ventures would be funded by the federal government and foundations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Education reform had become big business. Among the big winners in this era of education reform were commercial reading programs. They guaranteed improved reading achievement in reading if schools adopted their programs and, most importantly, implemented them with fidelity. These were phonics-based programs aligned with the mandates of No Child Left Behind and Reading First. They promised great things, and nobody could argue with the good intentions of these program developers. I mean, who wouldn't want their students to be successful? The victors in the reading wars were, I imagine, giddy at this point, particularly with all the Reading First funds freely available for schools to purchase their programs. As a teacher and reading specialist at the time, I can only imagine myself as hopeful that my students, many of whom were from low-income communities and struggling to achieve grade-level literacy skills, would finally find equity in the form of a methodology grounded in sound research. Once the money profit for education reform was firmly established, there was no going back. Although by 2006, 2007, it was widely agreed that No Child Left Behind was a failure, free market ideology would ensure that there would always be a ready market for those invested in the notion of the need for continuous reform in education. By 2009, the forces, nonprofit organizations, publishers, and governmental agencies were poised for the next round of large-scale education reform. The Common Core was rolled out as the next big fix, and Race to the Top funds showered down on the states to implement mandates that would dramatically impact schools, teachers, and students with increased testing, big data, and prepackaged curricula. This time, however, early reading instruction was not the only target for reform. The Common Core targeted all grades, with math and literacy as a primary focus. However, to be sure, reading instruction has always been the most contentious and arguably the most profitable arena for those who wish to cash in on education reform. And the merry-go-round continues to revolve. Bystanders continue to wave. Fueled by a continuous stream of data, education reformers continue to try to find the culprit to blame for a lack of improvement in reading achievement. Every 2 years, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, most often referred to as NAEP, publishes data for each state, often with alarming headlines about the dismal state of education. I'll discuss NAEP in a future video, but what's important to note is that NAEP test scores are the fuel for big business looking to profit from the education market. Recently, we saw headlines about the newest bout in the reading wars. Remember the truths I referred to with those offering a balanced approach to reading instruction? While the truce has been challenged over and over again with each iteration of reading reform initiatives, it seems that now the truce has been completely broken. Long revered reading education experts like Lucy Calkins, who is associated with the Teachers College of Columbia University, have found themselves in the spotlight and declared as failures. A large number of New York City schools were using Lucy Calkins' units of study for teaching reading, but recently, Mayor Eric Adams and his Chancellor of Education, David Banks, have declared her balanced reading approach a failure. Balanced reading is out. New York City public schools are now mandated to select from one of three reading programs: Wit and Wisdom by Great Minds, Expeditionary Learning, or Houghton Mifflin Harcourt's Into Reading program. All three of these provide an emphasis on early phonics instruction as the foundation for reading success. Remember at the beginning of the video when I spoke about the latest iteration in reading reform known as the science of reading, and I posed the question, is it really new? Well, as the book of Ecclesiastes reminds us, there really is nothing new under the sun. What goes around comes around, just like a merry-go-round. So as you'll recall, the concept of scientifically based reading research, SBRR, was the mantra of the No Child Left Behind legislation. Well, to be sure, science and research are the cornerstone for what we know as teachers. However, when No Child Left Behind proved to be ineffective, the education reform market was poised to reinvent themselves with the current mantra, the science of reading. I suppose they count on the public to have a very short memory. Well, anything deemed to be aligned with science of reading is good and full of promise. To me, however, this is merely an exercise in marketing and branding. Time will tell. However, one thing is certain: the reading wars will continue. Education reform will forever be with us. Phonics is not really good or bad. Balanced reading instruction is not good or bad. Teaching reading using a whole word method and sight words is not good or bad. These are all just simply methodologies. What's good is teaching children to read, and good teachers are indispensable to that process. Thank you for spending some time with me to share some tea and some truth. Please look forward to future videos where I'll discuss other topics in education and literacy.